What's good guys, my name is Oleg Nikitin, you're watching No Limits On channel from Russia with love, and today we're comparing the Sony ZV-1 with built-in 24-70 f1.8 f2.8 lens with iPhone 13 Pro Max. You know about it, let's go. Almost a year ago I compared the ZV-1 with iPhone 12 Pro Max, and you can find it below the like button or in the YouTube card, and now let's compare 13 Pro Max and ZV-1. The size and weight is almost identical, 300 grams on the ZV-1 versus 238 grams on the iPhone. We have 1-inch sensor on the ZV-1 and 0.6-inch sensor on the iPhone main camera. And also last time I compared the JPEGs, and now I'm comparing the RAWs. Also, ZV-1 has built-in ND filter, it's not variable, just one fixed ND, and I used it occasionally. And for the iPhone you need to buy a separate set of ND filters. Let's start off with comparing the photo quality of the ZV-1 at the left, 24mm, and iPhone 13 Pro Max on the right, 1x camera. You can see the before and after on both cameras. As you can see, we can have a lot of detail and information from the shadows when using RAW. Also, I'm not comparing the ultra-wide angle camera of the iPhone with the ZV-1 because ZV-1 is limited to 24mm on the wide end. You can have a look at wide-angle adapters for the ZV-1, but I didn't use one and I can't say if it ruins the quality. Also, do not forget that ZV-1 is a 20-megapixel camera, whereas the iPhone is 12-megapixel on all three camera modules. When we look at 300% crop, we can see that the ZV-1 has more detail and less digital sharpening, which is good in my opinion. I have to mention that both RAWs are just great in terms of editing, and now we crop in 500% and you can definitely see the difference between 20 megapixel on the ZV-1 and 12 megapixel on the iPhone. Also, I didn't touch the colors, so we can see straight away that the ZV-1 is more towards magenta and orange colors, and the iPhone leaning towards green, cyan, and yellow colors. The natural bokeh is better on the ZV-1, we have a bigger sensor and f1.8. On the iPhone, on the main camera, we have f1.5, but still a pretty tiny sensor, that is why we get less natural blur. Macro shots and close focusing with the ZV-1 is kinda challenging, probably I should have closed the aperture a little bit, but I wanted to create some kind of dreamy look, but the close-up image quality on the ZV-1 is kinda so-so. On the iPhone, on the other hand, we can focus much closer with the ultra-wide camera, which is great, but the quality is still not the best one. Now let's move on to 70mm on the ZV-1 with f2.8 minimal aperture and 3x telephoto 77mm equivalent on the iPhone. I can say that I do prefer the ZV-1 shots because of less digital sharpness and we have more detail in those shots. You can see this especially well on this shot with the buildings and trees. iPhone is just a total noise reduction blurry mess, whereas we have some noise of course on the ZV-1, but still it's looking much better, at least to my eye. Let's move on to the selfies. As you can see, without portrait mode, the iPhone is pretty flat, and with the portrait mode, you have to be really careful because when I was in front of the leaves, you can see some artifacts of background separation. When I recomposed the shot, it became better, but still I don't like the separation near my ears, so you gotta be careful with it. And now let's take some portrait shots with my daughter, her name is Ksusha, and on 24mm and 1x camera on the iPhone we get kinda similar results, but I'm more interested in the portrait mode on the iPhone. With the portrait mode, we see a dramatic difference and the iPhone is looking pretty good, but still it's not as sharp and it's pretty flat in terms of skin. I don't really like it. And here is the shot without portrait mode, but we still do have some physical blur on the iPhone picture. And with the portrait mode we get a lot of blur, but still I'm not really satisfied with the separation. On 70mm and 3x camera on the iPhone we get such picture without portrait mode, almost no background blur, and I'd say the Z1 has a touch more noise, but also more detail, and less digital sharpening of course. In the portrait mode, iPhone did pretty well. If you are not pixel peeping, you can definitely see that this picture pops out a little more. And now the selfie mode, once again without portrait mode it's a pretty flat picture, and with the portrait mode, iPhone adds a ton of digital sharpening and I look like 2 years older almost. And now let's move on to night mode and nighttime shooting. Please read the settings of both cameras. We'll always get much noisier but more detailed picture with the ZV-1 and much more noise reduced picture, pretty soft and flat picture on the iPhone 13 Pro Max. And in portrait mode we get even more digital sharpening because the iPhone is trying to hide the motion blur from the night mode and long exposure shots. I would prefer more noisy picture but with more detail, and by the way, the noise itself on the ZV-1 is pretty fine and I like it. On 3200 ISO we see a ton of noise on the ZV-1. iPhone is doing better in terms of noise reduction, but still I do prefer the ZV-1's picture because it's not that plasticky and flat. And also we have a ton more detail. On 70mm and 3x camera we do have some problems with shutter speeds. I used 1/50 shutter speed on the ZV-1 and also the night mode with 2 or 3 seconds on the iPhone. And those cameras are definitely not the best for such low light scenarios, especially with those focal ranges with low apertures. Then I put both cameras onto my tripod and I tried to make some long exposure shots, and probably ZV-1 is too small, and when I was pushing the shutter button I still introduced some motion into the camera. That is why I didn't have a pretty sharp image. But if you use a remote controller for instance, or if you'll be a little more careful, you can definitely get away with those shots. Now let's move on to video shooting. Both cameras have some issues. For instance, iPhone 13 Pro Max is over sharpening the picture. You can see this on the leaves especially, and the ZV-1 is kind of so-so in terms of stabilization at first, and also it has lower dynamic range if you're not using something like S-Log2, which I'll show you in a minute. On 70mm we also get better picture on the ZV-1. It's looking more natural and not that digitally sharpened. Also using the minimal focus and distance and f1.8 we can get some outstanding shots, kind of macro on the ZV-1. Okay guys, now we're using the selfie camera on the iPhone and the widest angle on the ZV-1. Also we have steady shot standard, and as well we compare the sound quality of both of those devices. So how do you like the footage? By the way, it's PP1 movie gamma, so it's right out of camera, and I can see that my sky is a little bit overexposed, which is okay, and the iPhone is doing pretty good. I'm just not messing around in the selfie mode with the S-Log. In terms of microphones, I think you got your own conclusions. Speaking of S-Log, this is the S-Log2 picture without grading. I was exposing for the highlights, by the way. And the minimal ISO in S-Log2 on the ZV-1 is 1000. That is why we get kind of noisy picture, especially if you push the shadows. And when we crop in, we can see that it's kind of a noisy mess and it's not that much detail in it. But we can use the PP1 movie gamma instead, which is a great picture profile for ZV-1, and I do recommend using this one. And look how much more detail we get in those leaves and buildings. I do prefer using this profile, and it's better than the iPhone's picture. Now let's talk about the stabilization. The ZV-1 has two modes, the standard mode and the active with a bit of a crop. It's a pretty strong crop to be honest, but both of those modes are way worse than the iPhone stabilization, which is just through the roof and from another level. I shot this handheld and you can see the difference, it's substantial.
Where I take it and you know I do it well. When I come through, better show up respect. I ain't want nothing but that motherfucking check. You can catch me at your door, you can catch me in your home.
And here is S-Log2 without grading and with grading. As you can see on those examples, S-Log2 is not the best profile for the ZV-1, too much noise and noise reduction, and probably it's not even true 4K to my eye. But of course it was set to 4K.
Don't fuck with me, don't fuck with me. If you hold back, just remember this, please. Alright, they try, but they'll never get by, baby. Alright.
And here is the ProRes 422 4K video from the iPhone 13 Pro Max using Filmic Pro app. As you can see, if we add some sharpening to Sony ZV-1, it has kind of comparable digital sharpening, but it's too much to my eye on the iPhone still. And to be honest, I don't see a dramatic difference between ProRes 422 and the normal HEVC recording. I even have two separate videos on this topic. You can check those out after watching this video in the description below. And to be honest, it's not worth it in my opinion. Sony ZV-1 is a very strong camera in terms of slow motion. You can shoot up to 1000 frames per second. Here's the shot in 500 frames per second, and it's looking pretty soft, but even better to my eye than the iPhone's 240 frames per second, because the iPhone's is just too over sharpened. Then we have 250 frames per second on the ZV-1, which is looking pretty decent to my eye. And I have to mention that you have around 4 seconds to shoot this slow motion on the ZV-1, and you can shoot without limits with Full HD up to 120 frames per second, which is looking also pretty decent to my eye. iPhone slow motion is so. Now let's get to shooting video in low light. As you can see, 640 ISO on the ZV-1 is kind of okay, and it's much better than the iPhone, because iPhone is trying to raise the exposure and then it reduces the noise, like a tons of noise reduction right here, and we almost lose all the detail, everything is flat, and we have a ton of artifacts as well. So here my choice is the ZV-1 for sure. Also I have to mention that we have much stronger light leaks and flares on the iPhone camera. Look at this light pole. And on 70mm with the ZV-1 we have ISO 1250, and still we get kinda decent picture, much better than the telecamera of the iPhone. Well, the weather is pretty shitty, guys. It's damn disgusting. As you can see, I'm right here, and probably the lens is already covered with the raindrops, and it's not really weather sealed with the ZV-1, but now you can see how it looks like in low light performance. And guys, you'd better use the dead cat which is in the box of the ZV-1, because when it's windy, it's pretty bad in terms of sound. And also if you shoot 4K on the ZV-1, your screen will be dimmed to a pretty low amount of nits. And when you use 1080p and sunny weather mode, it's pretty viewable. Just keep that in mind, because I almost every time shoot in 4K only. And now some benefits and disadvantages of both cameras. On the Sony ZV-1 we can stream, and it's a great tool for streaming. A lot of my colleagues use this camera for streaming. Also, it's easier to match the picture quality with your Sony cameras. It doesn't have this huge amount of digital sharpening. Also, it's much better in terms of swivel screen or flip out screen. It's easier to look at when you're doing something like vlogging. And also you can buy any amount of SD cards, whereas the iPhone is pretty limited. On the other hand, the iPhone has bigger dynamic range thanks to computational photography and videography. It does have 4K 60, whereas ZV-1 is limited to 4K 30. Also, it has 10-bit video versus 8-bit video on the ZV-1. iPhone has 13mm lens, ultra-wide, and the files are pretty much ready for your social network. Also, it does have better stabilization, as you saw before, and sometimes the portrait mode is doing a pretty astonishing job. And also, iPhone is better in terms of display. It's just brighter, bigger, and better. I'm not saying the one is better than the other, because it really depends on the circumstances you're going to use those devices in. I've compared almost every aspect in my video with 12 Pro Max and this one, and now it's up to you to decide which one is more suitable for you. And the final thing that I'd like to talk about is the price. The price difference is around $300, and it really depends which iPhone you pick. It can be 128 gigs or 256 or 1 terabyte iPhone, which is pretty expensive. Also, you have to buy some additional batteries or better power bank for your ZV-1, and also some SD cards. But even though, you'll definitely save up some cash compared to the iPhone. So my suggestion is, if you have a pretty good smartphone right now and you want a second camera for your Sony camera, or just a travel vlogging camera, something to carry around with you, and you do prefer this look, just go for the ZV-1. And to be honest, I really enjoyed using this tiny camera. So guys, what would you pick? Sony ZV-1 or iPhone 13 Pro Max for your personal photo and video needs? Please share your thoughts in the comment section below. Also, if you did enjoy watching this video, please smash the like and subscribe buttons as I say in my videos, and hit the notifications bell. My name is Oleg Nikitin, you've been watching No Limits on channel. Warmest hugs from Russia. See you in the next video, guys. Take care. Bye.